I just want to sort of back up a little bit and say what the objective of proposing domicide as a crime under international law is, or more generally, what do we expect when we name something as a crime under international law? Do we really expect, as we do under domestic law, that when something is named as a crime, we expect a legal system to formally sort of swing into action, take further steps by prosecuting the individuals, and then, of course, sending them to prison or holding them accountable in other ways? But I just want to say that in international law, or generally in international relations, that is not always, in fact, the most important sort of consequence that we expect when we name something as a crime. Generally, the reason for naming something as a crime goes beyond simply the formal legal response. It has to do with the process of delegitimation and the process of creating a culture of transformation. Uh, by naming a particular act as the unconscionable, unmentionable, and the impossible thing to do, we seek to permanently prevent its commission and then to provide legitimacy to those who are standing up against it. The idea is to legitimate narratives of those who are opposing destruction of their way of life, or whatever they are protecting against.
Welcome to the Opinion Euros podcast. The following is a conversation with Balakrishnan Rajagopal, one of the leading voices in international law and human rights, whose work is actively reshaping and redefining how we understand the link between human rights, housing rights, and international criminal law. Professor Rajagopal, affectionately known as Raj, has been serving as the UN Special Rapporteur for Adequate Housing since 2020. He's also a distinguished professor at MIT's Department of Urban Planning, where his scholarship bridges the gap between housing rights, law, and development. For many scholars, Raj's groundbreaking book, International Law from Below, was one of the very first to transform and critique how we think about international law's relationship with social movements. By centering the perspectives of those marginalized by the legal system, he demonstrated how social movements in the global south have shaped and continue to shape international law, challenging the conventional top down narrative of legal development. What makes his work particularly compelling is his innovative approach to addressing protection gaps in the legal system. His recent advocacy for the recognition of domicide, the widespread or systematic destruction of housing, as a crime against humanity, is a crucial intervention in human rights law and criminal law. This concept emerges from his observation that existing legal frameworks, like the Geneva Conventions, treat homes merely as property rather than recognizing their profound significance for human dignity and cultural identity. In today's episode, we'll explore Raj's groundbreaking work on domicide, examine how this concept helps us understand contemporary conflicts from Gaza to Ukraine. We'll also delve into his experiences as Special Rapporteur, discussing the challenges in advancing housing rights in an international system that often treats economic, social, and cultural rights as secondary concerns. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Balakrishnan Rajagopal.
All right, welcome to our episode of Fresh Squeezed. Today we're fortunate enough to have with us Professor Balakrishnan Rajagopal, affectionately known as Raj. He has been the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing since roughly May 2020. Raj is a Professor of Law and Development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's a lawyer, he's a professor, he's obviously a special rapporteur and an expert on many areas of international law, human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, the UN system, and of course, the human rights challenges posed by capitalism. So, Professor Raj, we're delighted to have you with us here today. And we wanted to have a conversation about domicide. In your capacity as Special Rapporteur, you've obviously been doing a lot of work around this. And we're wondering if you could tell us a little bit then about the concept of domicide and What is the type of violence that this concept is seeking to capture that you believe might otherwise be overlooked within extant international law?
Thanks for having me. I advocated for domicide in my report in 2022 to the UN General Assembly because increasingly what I was witnessing around the world is mass destruction of housing happening in the context of armed conflict or in the context of other uh, uses of force by states concerned, including the context of development projects where large numbers of people's homes were being destroyed without any kind of justification. And so the idea of domicide was intended to capture mass destruction of housing that is largely indiscriminate or it is widespread. And therefore, to suggest that domicide should be recognized as a standalone crime for its on its own standing, and that it should be recognized as a crime against humanity. Now, protection of homes does exist under international law, but it is recognized more as property, but not as housing. It is not recognized as a human right to housing. So, Geneva Conventions, for example, including the additional protocols, treat a home essentially as property, and therefore they use the word civilian objects. But civilian object is a very clinical term that doesn't quite capture the emotional or other attachments that people have to their own homes. It's the term civilian object is basically a term that makes sense only from the perspective of military commanders, but it doesn't make sense from the perspective of the people living in a home. If you're living in a home, you don't think of it as a civilian object, you think of it as home, and that gives meaning in other ways to it. So, and that is quite understandable because the Geneva Convention's protection of a home really comes from the 1940s, a period that predated the recognition of economic, social, and cultural rights as human rights, including the right to adequate housing, which became recognized gradually only after the 1960s with the adoption of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and other treaties under international law. So we have a set of rules that apply to the in terms of the laws of war, the so-called jus ad bellum, and jus in bello rules that exist. But these rules actually don't fully sort of anticipate or are able to respond to the damage that is caused to the human rights of individuals. So the human rights regime evolved quite rapidly since the 1960s and has evolved to a point where the old rules of the laws of war, they need to, come up with new sort of ways of recognizing harm that is caused to communities and individuals. So that's one reason. The other way in which domicide can also be prosecuted, or mass destruction of housing can also be prosecuted or held accountable under international law is, of course, when mass destruction of housing is caused as part of a widespread sort of attack that is genocidal in nature. That is, it's accompanied by an intention to eliminate in whole or in part a national, ethnic, religious, or other group under the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention. Now, that's what South Africa argued, for example, in its petition before the ICJ uh, against Israel recently, that the conditions that have been created have made the place so uninhabitable in Gaza that, in fact, the violence unleashed on Gaza amount to an act of genocide. Now, that may very well be the case, and I believe that if there is evidence, it should be prosecuted, of course, and Israel should be held accountable under the ICJ case when the ruling comes out for its genocidal acts. But on the other hand, it's a very high bar, including the question of proof of intention, and also the the kind of groups that are protected under the Genocide Convention don't always cover all the groups that are victims of violence. You have to belong to one of those protected groups under the definition of the Genocide Convention. So, in many ways, it makes sense to actually propose that mass destruction of housing that we are increasingly seeing as part of warfare, and also seeing, unfortunately, outside of the context of warfare, in the context of governments destroying hundreds of thousands of homes in order to bring about, achievements of other objectives, including conservation, development, and so on and so forth. This should be actually treated more seriously under international law than what we have been doing so far. That's basically the reason why I proposed the recognition of domicide as a standalone crime.
If I can just ask a quick follow-up question before handing it over then to Janan. So we've seen, and you've mentioned Palestine and Israel, and certainly we could add to the mix then Lebanon. And what we've seen Israel do as of late has been to, not only as of late, as in there's a history of this, of bombing specifically housing, targeting then the homes of a number of individuals. And I wonder to what extent is this something then that would fall under your conception of domicide, or is that something apart and we should be treating that specifically as a type of war crime because they're targeting not just the civilian objects, but also the civilians themselves?
Well, it is definitely is a war crime in the context of the lack of any distinction in the use of force between military and civilian objects. That is quite evident in the way in which Israel has been fighting its war in Gaza and also in southern Lebanon, where you see, for example, the Israeli forces clear an area and there is nobody there, and then the Israeli engineering battalions move in, and then they place explosives or charges within buildings, and then they bring them down through controlled demolitions. We have seen that repeatedly over many, many areas now, of course, in Gaza, but also increasingly in southern Lebanon. So clearly, these are war crimes, but because they are so widespread and so indiscriminate, there is simply no distinction that is being made between civilian and military objects. And the scale of destruction is so vast that it goes beyond simply war crimes. They're also crimes against humanity. Uh, and what I do think is that what we have been seeing in Gaza, where over 70,000 homes have been completely destroyed, and in southern Lebanon, where the impact of the fighting in southern Lebanon already has pushed almost one fifth of the population of Lebanon to become forcibly displaced. It is really what we are really seeing is definitely an act of domicide, and for which Israel and its accomplices who supply weapons and provide support must be held accountable.
Thank you very much for that, Raj. Very comprehensive answer. So you alluded to domicide now as a crime against humanity, also a war crime, also perhaps being one of the acts or being proof of intention of genocide. So is domicide then, does it complement, or how does it complement these other recognized human rights violations? And in Gaza, because you specifically mentioned Gaza, do you see that it's separate to genocide or part of the evidence for genocide or a proof of the intention of genocide? If you could perhaps expand on those.
Yes, the main reason why domicide as a standalone crime, as a crime against humanity, is needed under international law is because we have a protection gap under international law right now. As I said, right now, homes are protected simply as property under the laws of war, under the Geneva Conventions, and those protections have been quite weak and ineffectual. In fact, if you look at the number of prosecutions, even for violations of the Geneva Conventions, uh, where people have been prosecuted for destroying homes, in fact, there are very, very few prosecutions, if any, starting from World War II. So even Clearly, the protection of homes as civilian objects under the laws of war has not really led to accountability. Um, and as far as the large scale destruction of homes, when it is accompanied by an intention to eliminate a people in whole or in part, and we have seen that in many conflicts. We saw that in Rwanda, where armed groups belonging to the state actually systematically demolished homes. We saw it in the former Yugoslavia, where homes were systematically attacked and destroyed between the warring parties. We are seeing it currently in Sudan, for example, where homes are being torched and burned by the RSF as they rampage their way through the areas controlled by the other side. We have seen it in Myanmar, where the government forces have engaged in large scale uses of force against perceived enemies belonging to other ethnic groups. Um, we, of course, have seen it in Ukraine, where you just look at the destruction of Mariupol, for example, which is still under occupation now, where over 90% of the buildings of Mariupol were damaged and destroyed. I mean, it's a city of 400,000 people now, down to, of the original inhabitants, we have what, about 120,000 left now. So this is a destruction, an utter annihilation of a place. Now, Gaza compares very much, and in fact goes one step further in terms of the gravity compared to all these instances that I've just mentioned. Because in the case of Gaza, what is also different is that it is accompanied very clearly by an intention to eliminate the people in whole or in part. That is because of not only various public statements issued by leaders who are in charge of the military campaign that make it quite clear that they want to erase the Palestinians as a people from Gaza, but it's also because of the type of warfare that we have seen. The actual conduct of hostilities has been carried out in a way which erases any sign of not only current life, but any possibility of future life. So it's not just the homes that are destroyed, but the infrastructure is destroyed. Even the roads are dug up, for example. Water wells are dug up, and the power supply, any infrastructure that exists, any public buildings that exist, for example, not just religious buildings and others, but even public buildings like the Palace of Justice were blown up and destroyed. There is really nothing standing there at this point when we look at the type of destruction that we've been seeing in Gaza. So Gaza definitely goes one step beyond either war crimes or crimes against humanity, but also escalates to the level of an act of genocide uh, because of the very clear presence of intention to eliminate the people of Palestine from Gaza in whole or in part. Um, so I do believe that just like in domestic law, the same act can constitute many different crimes. So the destruction of a home in international law can also be simultaneously a war crime, a crime against humanity, and an act of genocide. And I hope that it is perceived and approached that way.
Thanks for this, Raj. While we're on the idea of implications of domicide, and so you spoke about the legal implications right now, uh, it seems, reading your report, that there is still a relationship between domicide and then forms of systemic violence. And I was just wondering if you could tell us more about those forms, this relationship between the two of them and other forms of systemic violence, right? So, cultural erasure, economic exploitation, ethnic displacement. How does domicide contribute to systemic violence generally?
Well, the idea of domicide as a mass destruction of housing must be again understood not simply as a destruction of, for example, a series of houses understood as property. It's not just property loss; it's the sentimental and emotional and cultural sort of value of the space and the way in which people who live there perceive the value of that space for themselves. So, destroying houses in that sense is also destroying the ability of a people to live as a people. Uh, Now, the problem with that approach in terms of legal definitions that we have in international law, whether such a destruction of an ability of a people to live as a people still could be prosecuted as a crime, is that it is not very clear, because cultural genocide, for example, is not really considered so far as an act of genocide so far. It has to be a physical destruction. So, making it impossible for a people, for example, to live in their traditional areas in which they have lived is not simply an act of genocide at this stage. There has to be proof that whoever is perpetrating the attack against them actually intends to physically erase them. That has been the approach adopted by courts and by scholarship on genocide so far. So, but what we see increasingly is that while we do have cases where such intentions to completely erase a population do exist, we have far more numerous instances of cases where people are they lose their homes on a very vast scale, and there is a mass destruction of their housing and their cultural identity as such. But there is really no way to actually hold people accountable for that. And we see that, as I said, not only in the context of warfare, but also in the context of a variety of different actions taken by those in power uh, uh, for reasons that have to do with development or conservation or other matters. And I deal with those cases all the time. Just to give you one example, um, the Neom city, which is a new city that Saudi Arabia is building in the middle of the desert, involved the destruction of the homes of over 30,000 members of the Al Hawita tribe, who have been violently relocated to another place, and many have been killed and arrested, and some have been sentenced to death as well. Now, this is a case in which I've intervened with the Saudi government. I've not received any response to my letter to the Saudi government yet, and I hope I receive a response soon. But the reality is that the destruction of homes that this community went through is no less a serious an offense against against these people than if it was motivated by some other reason, for example, in the context of warfare. Now, the fact that this destruction didn't happen in the context of an armed conflict doesn't make it any less of an act of domicide. So I do think that it's very important to sort of keep the framing around crime against humanity, because crimes against humanity do not require a nexus with armed conflict under international law, the way, for example, war crimes do. War crimes, in the end, ultimately have to be committed in the course of what is an armed conflict under international law. But we don't have that requirement for crimes against humanity. They can be committed during so called peacetime as well. And we see a lot of those happening. So I want to keep the door open for that, because, in fact, a far more number of crimes are committed in the name of progress and in the name of bringing about improvement around the world.
Thanks, Raj. I suppose maybe then the other question that I would want to ask is what would be the elements of the crime of domicide, and then what obligations would states have in terms of, I mean, we have the Genocide Convention, which is obligation to prevent and suppress and punish. Obviously, states would be obligated not to commit domicide, but would their obligations go beyond that? And yeah, and what would be, I suppose, the elements of the crime?
Right. These are very important questions, and I hope that we develop an understanding of the various technical dimensions, including elements of the crime, as we go forward. And I will provide some answers for that. But I just want to sort of back up a little bit and say just to clarify what the objective of proposing domicide as a crime under international law is, or more generally, what do we expect when we name something as a crime under international law? Do we really expect, as we do under domestic law, that when something is named as a crime, we expect the legal system to formally sort of swing into action, take further steps by prosecuting the individuals, and then, of course, sending them to prison or holding them accountable in other ways? In other words, a penal system response is what we expect when we name something as a crime. But I just want to say that in international law, or generally in international relations, that is not always, in fact, the most important sort of consequence that we expect when we name something as a crime. Generally, the reason for naming something as a crime goes beyond simply the formal legal response. It has to do with the process of delegitimation and the process of creating a culture of transformation. Uh, by naming a particular act as the unconscionable, unmentionable, and the impossible thing to do, we seek to permanently prevent its commission and then to provide legitimacy to those who are standing up against it. The idea is to legitimate narratives of those who are opposing destruction of their way of life, or whatever they are protecting against. So if you take even the history of genocide, for example, under international law, are we really seriously to believe that genocide is actually the so-called crime of crimes because it has repeatedly been used to prosecute individuals over the last 70 years? I mean, honestly, if you look at how many people have been prosecuted for the act of genocide, I mean, it's just not, we don't think about genocide as the most serious of crimes because somehow when you commit it, there is no way you can get away with it. You always get prosecuted. But that's not why we think of genocide as a crime of crimes. But it's because it has been used to create a culture of aversion to it, a culture of treating that particular act as something that is beyond civilization. And so there is quite a lot to naming something as a crime, um, not simply to anticipate that we have a formal sort of legal response to it. But on the other hand, I mean, the legal responses are very important. And in terms of domicide, the elements of a crime are that first, that it should be widespread or systematic, which are key elements of crime against humanity, for example, under Article 7 of the ICC, the Rome Statute, for example, and that the widespread and systematic attack be uh, perpetrated uh, uh, with an impact on the right to adequate housing. That's how I have proposed it. So the idea is not necessarily the physical destruction of a building. You can imagine, for example, an area being chemically bombed, or a country drops, for example, a nerve bomb in an area, which doesn't necessarily destroy the buildings in the area, but it actually makes people, is they either they end up dying or they end up leaving because there is a nerve bomb that has fallen in the area and you have to actually forcibly evacuate that area, and you cannot return if there is a chemical bomb, for example, for quite a long time. Their right to adequate housing has been massively violated. So the widespread or systematic destruction or indiscriminate destruction, sorry, is of not necessarily buildings, but of the right to adequate housing. Now, the right to adequate housing has a particular technical meaning under international law, defined under, for example, General Comment number 4 of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and has 7 elements under international law, and such as security of tenure, adequacy, accessibility, affordability, and so on and so forth. And these elements together constitute adequate housing. And when the exercise of this right has become impossible because of widespread or systematic attack on of any kind, then it must be treated as a crime against humanity. So, just to again clarify that the idea is not to see that the idea is not to suggest that domicide is committed only when we have buildings reduced to rubble. That is not necessarily the only way in which I have proposed domicide can be committed. So it kind of expands the framework of what we mean by domicide in that sense. And in terms of what obligations it imposes on states and non-state actors, including on businesses, yes, there is, of course, a duty to prevent and avoid the commission of domicide, which also includes the heightened exercise of due diligence on the part of actors before they engage in actions that have a heightened risk of mass destruction of the right to adequate housing. And we also have the duty to prosecute or hold accountable in other ways, including through non prosecutorial means when actions do amount to acts of domicide. And then there is a duty to repair, there is a duty of reparation in terms of the damages that are caused to the people and the ability of the people who are affected to repair their lives and to recover from the damage that is caused. So these duties are all together: the duty to prevent, the duty uh, to uh, to hold people accountable, as well as the duty to repair, are all concomitant duties that flow from the recognition of domicide as a crime under international law, and they're all well established under legal doctrines that we already have, including the uh, through the work of various legal bodies. So uh, I hope this answers your question.
So I really appreciate the way you opened that question and bringing in that sociological angle and that idea. Use the term that we create crimes to legitimate narratives. And in fact, I think we're going to even build our introduction to your podcast around that. That'll likely be the title of it. So I like that one in part because of the point you made, but also because it leads nicely into a political question then that I have. And I'm wondering how you might respond to some of the criticisms that have been leveled against this idea of domicide. I've heard a similar criticism leveled against the concept of ecocide. And in fact, we're going to interview Professor Kevin Heller on this in a couple of weeks. So the criticism is that, well, international law already has plenty of mechanisms to address housing destruction. But really what's missing, and here's the political element, what's missing is the political will to enforce them. So wondering how you might respond to that criticism.
Well, there is a political will to enforce any part of international law at this stage. Even the so-called peremptory norms of international law, including the acquisition of territory by force, annexation, is not being enforced at this point. Uh, so, I mean, who are we kidding to believe that some elements of international law are somehow better protected, and somehow proposing new elements of international law would make no sense because they don't have a chance of getting implemented in the same way? I mean, nothing is getting implemented at this stage. Um, so the reality is that international law is a terrain of contestation. It's a terrain of contestation over meanings. It's a terrain of contestation over stakes of what people expect to sort of get out of it, and we should join the struggle instead of shying away from it. That's the way I see it. Uh, and if international law can be used to fight the battle, why not use it to actually use it to engage in the struggle? Now, ecocide also is another crime, along with, in the case of Gaza, for example, many of us, UN special rapporteurs, also propose the term scholasticide because of the utter destruction of the educational system in Gaza. Uh, Now, urban planners look at the vast destruction of Gaza, which was more than 77% urban before the war started, for example. it was largely an urban society. They look at the vast destruction of all the cities in Gaza and they're calling it herbicide. So there are many different framings that are being used, and not all of them are being proposed with the expectation that somehow some international court will swing into action and some prosecutor will issue arrest warrants. Now, that's a very legal response. And as I said, the more important thing is to create a narrative of legitimacy and to by naming something and by calling attention to its effects, we seek to create an understanding, a shared popular or public understanding of what is permissible and what is not permissible, or at least ask questions about why are we allowing these things to happen as a moral question to be considered with more seriousness. Otherwise, these kinds of distractions simply happen and no one really cares about them. We don't have a language to even speak about it. So I think it's very important that we don't actually give in to this idea that this artificially legal idea that we cannot name something as a crime unless there is 100% chance of it being somehow, implemented. But if we go by that standard, in fact, we wouldn't have much of domestic law. A lot of domestic law doesn't get implemented either in the same way. But are we to abandon faith in all law then?
So let's stay then with this idea of how domicide has been received. And I'm specifically curious about the reactions of two specific entities. First, the communities who have been victims of domicide, and second, of governments. So, how have each of those parties reacted to your introduction or your popularization of this concept?
Well, the communities concerned don't really care what we call them, really, whether it's domicide or some other term, or that it will be treated as an international crime. But they do care that people are paying attention to the destruction of their homes, and they've lost homes, and this is a very material loss for them. This is a very devastating blow. I mean, I was recently speaking to Palestinian families in when I was in Cairo, for example, who had fled from Gaza, and they were describing the kind of sense of loss and the type of destruction that their homes actually, experienced, and they get it. They understand that destroying homes in this way is really an unconscionable act, an act that should be treated as a crime. And they are very happy to see that people around the world, including UN experts like me, are taking it seriously, and they are actually treating it with the gravity that it deserves. It's not simply property. So I don't, for example, begin a conversation by asking them, okay, how much, what is the value of the property that you lost? So the conversation doesn't really get to, okay, how can you be compensated for what you've lost? That will be a very narrow and artificial way to speak to them about what they've truly lost. It's not just property, it's much more than that they've lost. And they really are engaging with in a conversation about the loss only because they see that the other side actually gets the true dimension of what they've lost. So, in that sense, the framing the issue of loss of home with the concept of domicide enables me to truly communicate with the people who have lost homes. Um, as far as the states are concerned, I would say many states have responded quite positively. In fact, when I presented my report at the UN General Assembly in 2022, most of the Western states very warmly welcomed my report because that was in the context of Russia in 2022 conducting a brutal warfare against Ukraine. And in fact, I referred to Mariupol, which had been destroyed by May of 2022. I was presenting my report in October, and every state, including the United States, got up and said that this is such a wonderful report. This is exactly what we need, and we need to be able to hold people accountable for causing this act of domicide and so on and so forth. 1 year later, when Gaza war had been launched, and we were 2 weeks into it when I returned to the General Assembly in October of 2023, I said the same thing. I said last year I spoke to you about Ukraine. This year we are unfortunately seeing the same thing happening in Gaza now. Because in 2 weeks it was obvious that the kind of warfare that we're witnessing in Gaza was already an act of domicide. And I said already in 2 weeks, 2 weeks after the conflict started, that what we are witnessing is actually already a domicide. And there was very little response from the states to that, to the so-called champions of human rights from Western states. So, I mean, the reality is that states remain what they've always been, which is that they are, basically not upholders of so much as international law, but they're upholders of their own national interest, using international law where it suits them, but nothing more than that. And all states are the same in that way. So, our states, I'm not saying that state support is not there, but I'm saying state support is very much contingent on whether states see the advocacy and support for domicide as being in their interests. And at this stage, for a variety of reasons, many states in the global south, they do support the advocacy of domicide because of the destruction of Gaza, because of the extension of warfare to Lebanon. There is quite a lot of support for that. There is still a good amount of support in among many European countries because of the usefulness of the concept of domicide to capture the destruction of Ukraine. So, in that sense, there is quite a lot of support around the world for that. I've also spoken to some state delegates about their interest in perhaps exploring the possibility of either discussing domicide if a convention of state parties is convened under the Geneva Conventions, as I think Switzerland intends to do, or that a state party meeting is convened to under the Rome Statute to discuss the possibility of an amendment under Article 7 of the ICC statute, which defines crimes against humanity. These conversations are ongoing, and we'll have to see if they actually lead to somewhere. But I also want to say that I'm not, I'm not only advocating that amendments be made to international legal instruments, especially at the global level. I'm also advocating for states to amend their own national laws to recognize domicide as a crime under their national laws to enable exercise of universal jurisdiction under the laws of these countries. And I'm also advocating that states pass amendments to their own laws governing their armed forces, including by changing the language of their military manuals. So armed forces can be retrained, and the rules of engagement or the ROEs can be transformed in a way that reflects a better sensitivity to the need to destroy vast, swathes of housing. Armed forces should reorient the way they think about destruction of housing and the calculation that goes into what is a military object and what is a civilian object. This is essential. In fact, it's more important that countries do that at the national level than that we have an amendment to, say, the ICC statute under Article 7.
So thanks for that answer then, Raj. We have just two more questions then for you, but we're going to switch then approaches shortly, or we're going to switch approaches here now and ask you a couple of questions about your role as Special Rapporteur, if you don't mind.
So in your role as Special Rapporteur, what do you see that you're trying to achieve? We obviously have special rapporteurs on a range of different issues that are of real importance to disenfranchised peoples. And so do you see your role as special rapporteur not just in terms of a mandate that you have to fulfill, but also somewhat of a cause?
Well, it's all cause. I mean, I believe that all legal work, unless you are advocating only in the context of private legal practice, um, legal work in the international field, particularly in the human rights field, is always a question of responding to a call and being motivated by a cause. We are all cause lawyers in the end, uh, but I do believe that uh, particularly when it comes to advocating for issues like housing, which affect a very vast number of people, but whose legal protection remains insufficient or poorly recognized under international law. Economic, social, and cultural rights are still treated as stepchildren under even within the human rights system. For example, uh, when uh, housing rights are violated on a massive basis, or when people face starvation on a massive basis, there is less outrage and focus, or when education system is massively destroyed, or when sources of water and sanitation are completely destroyed, there is less outrage than, for example, if an allegation of torture emerges. Uh, Now, torture is, of course, a horrible crime and must be prevented at all in every possible way. And certainly, when it happens, there must be an adequate and immediate response to hold people accountable. But the differences are quite stark. They do remain quite stark under international law even now. Economic, social, and cultural rights simply don't get treated the same way. So I do believe that one of the reasons I decided to do this job was to try to do my best to try to elevate the status of economic, social, and cultural rights, which matter so much more for the world's social majorities in a way that, unfortunately, is not yet reflected under international law. The international law still remains, with its baggage of being this this language of the elites of the formerly colonial regimes that actually prioritize protection of property and of the rights of those with property, but not those who have nothing.
One has to say, from the picture that is painted here, it's hard not to be frustrated with, I would say, the number of limitations that you have to deal with in your mandates, right? So we're talking about lack of resources, instrumentalization by government officials, attacks by opponents, absence of enforcement powers. How do you then navigate all these limitations while still trying to pursue your mandate?
That's a tough question. Well, I have to hope that I'm able to navigate these various uh, constraints and others, but perhaps not always quite successfully either. But I think that I must say that for me, what also gives me a great deal of motivation to work in the face of these is seeing what people like me who are in the special rapporteur system, what other special rapporteurs are also going through. They are also facing similar constraints, and some of them are actually facing worse attacks than what I have been facing. For example, the UN Special Rapporteur on OPT, Francesca Albanese, and the kind of gendered attacks that often come against people like her are particularly galling, really, in a way that I must say, just cross all norms of decency. There is simply, it seems like there are no limits to what states and other powerful actors will actually do when it comes to demonizing people or going after individuals who are simply doing their job of speaking the truth and looking at evidence and pointing out what's really happening. So that keeps me going, even if I have all these constraints of resource constraints and frustrating systemic issues and personal attacks and so on and so forth. Again, it's to me, it's like what I said when I met with these families in Cairo, these Palestinian families in Cairo. Those moments give meaning to the job that you do. because those are moments of solidarity, and those moments of solidarity give meaning to the work that you do. Not when I present my work before the UN General Assembly and so on and so forth, although they are the formal responsibilities, the things that really give meaning or what, the meetings that you have with the victims, and the meetings that you have, and the encounters that you have with those who are affected. So that's what basically keeps us going.
Thank you for that answer, Raj. It's really interesting that you end on that notion of solidarity. And I say it's really interesting for me because I recall reading your book, International Law from Below, and I recall reading it as a PhD. And what was evident in that text was that notion then of solidarity, and that attempt to build that solidarity with social movements and getting, whether it's international lawyers or practitioners or scholars, to start thinking about international law from the perspective of those who are often brutalized than by it, or brutalized than by states. And I'll say this in passing, you might not recall this, but in fact, after reading your book, it just so happened that you were going to attend a conference in Toronto where I was doing my PhD. And I sent you an email and I said, "Oh, hey, professor, I'd love to meet you. Can I take you out to dinner?" And to my great astonishment, you said yes. And then we had this dinner, and I have this memory, this vivid memory of sitting there at dinner with you, Raj. And so it's quite surreal to be then now, nearly 20 years later, and having this conversation and still seeing that same commitment, that same drive, that same sense of solidarity, that generosity then of time that you're expressing then to all these sort of young scholars out there who look up to you because of the way then that you approach international law that we find inspirational and something that we aspire to do. So we thank you very much for your work, and we thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us today. We're going to disseminate this widely, and we expect that many of our readers and many of our listeners are going to be very excited as we are to have had this opportunity to engage with you on these issues of domicide and your role as Special Rapporteur, which I have to say has been an inspiration then to all of us.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. Yes, I do remember that dinner, and actually, what keeps me going is really all the inspiring work that people like you and other young scholars are all doing. When I see this, I feel even more fired up to do more. So that's really a community. That's another level of solidarity. There is a solidarity with those who are affected, who are brutalized, as you said, but there is also solidarity with fellow warriors like you and all of you here. So that's what gives ultimately, the motivation and the drive to do the work.
Many thanks for that, Raj. It's really delightful to hear that. We thank you for it. Thank you very much for your time.